My name's Jameson, Hampton. My talk is called Reframing Shame and Embracing Mistakes. I don't have a clicker, so I'm kind of stuck behind my screen. First, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Jameson. My friends call me Jamie, and we're all friends, so you can call me Jamie if you want. I'm here in Atlanta for the first time, which is awesome, from Buffalo, New York. I used to do a joke at the beginning of all my talks where I said, I'm from Buffalo, New York, the home of bad sports. I'm retiring that joke. This is going to be the last time we do it, because it's not true anymore. I'm a Ruby developer. I work for a startup, a Ruby shop startup called Rapbook, which is pretty cool. We do payroll software for the entertainment industry, and we're hiring especially engineering managers, so come see me if you're interested about that. You can find me online at Jamie Bash pretty much everywhere, but particularly Twitter. Feel free to find me, add me, be my friend, send me pictures of your cats, tweet about my talk. Just please keep in mind if you're going to talk about me online that I use they, them pronouns. I also like to do a bunch of things outside of tech, which I wish we talked about a little more. I do letterpress printing, and I'm an artist. And also, very recently, I became a race car driver, and I basically just wanted to put my car photo. This is from like 5 days ago. I did my first race, so I'm pretty pumped about it. But let's talk about embracing mistakes. So I'm going to need you to raise your hand if you've ever introduced a bug in production or caused an incident. Okay, that's a lot of hands. I'm raising my hand to show you, but also because I've also done that. This is a talk about shame, and shame is a really powerful emotion. It runs deeper than similar emotions like embarrassment or guilt, which are usually primarily concerned with something that you've done, or perhaps something that you haven't done, as the case may be. But shame is primarily concerned with like who you are, and that makes it able to do damage to our self-worth in a much more insidious way than some of these other emotions. Now raise your hand if just now you lied about ever having caused an incident, or if you thought about lying before you raised your hand. You got a couple. That's because shame makes it really hard to admit to other people when we've made mistakes. And actually, that's kind of a shame in itself, because we learn a lot from making mistakes. In fact, it's kind of how we've been learning for our whole lives. It's how humans learn as like small children. We try things, we see how they go, and we try them again. And everybody makes mistakes. I have a former coworker who every time I like got frustrated or embarrassed at work would always say like, nobody is born knowing how to code. Nobody is born knowing any of this. Everybody has to learn it. A very wise person once said to me that wisdom is knowledge and understanding and experience. You have to have all three. If you haven't really experienced something, and a lot of that type of experience does come in the form of making mistakes, then you don't actually have wisdom about it yet. There's a case study I want to talk about. I have a couple of like slides that'll come back to this case study. It's possible you remember it. GitLab had a big outage in 2017, and I want to talk about, I think they handled it really well, which is why we're going to talk about it. But to like kind of set up the scene for why I was impressed with the way they handled it, we do have to like talk about what happened. So back in 2017, GitLab had about 18 hours of downtime. They lost about 300 gigs of production data that ended up being unrecoverable, so that was rough. It was caused by an error. A developer accidentally removed the database directory of the primary instead of the secondary database. They referred to this person in all of their communication about the incident as team member 1. You can actually go, this person has come out and like openly admitted who they are, so like you can look up who this was. But that was like his choice to come out with it. GitLab used team member 1, and so that's what I'm using. I really like this quote that they put out after the incident. At GitLab, we think that the people making the most mistakes frequently correlate with the people who are doing the most work. I think that's very true, and I like that they kind of said it like that. So I remember at the time when this happened, a lot of people were speculating about team member 1 getting fired, because that's what people do when there's a big incident. Oh, who's going to get fired for this? But actually, not long after, team member 1 got promoted. He had just qualified for a promotion to senior developer based on the GitLab career ladder, like just before the incident happened. And they decided, I think correctly, that making one mistake didn't like erase all of everything else he had accomplished, so he got promoted. In fact, I couldn't find the exact quote, but I very distinctly remember at the time people asking like folks from GitLab, like who's gonna get fired? And a few of them said things like, why would we fire him now? Like, he just is never gonna do that again. They also had these t-shirts made for all of their engineers who worked on this incident. And I really love this because, like, yeah, there's one person who, like, pressed the wrong button one time and became, like, weirdly famous for this one thing that happened. But really, like, it's on the whole team that there were no guardrails in place to prevent it. And in fact, it wouldn't have been nearly so bad if they had viable backups, but they didn't because they hadn't tested their backup procedure. And so that's on the whole team. And I think these shirts are kind of cute and funny and represent that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about GitLab in a minute. But the reason that I like this example is because talking about mistakes is like a really important part of the process. And like I was saying earlier, because of shame, it can be hard to admit when we've made a mistake. But everyone makes them, so if you claim that you've never made any mistakes ever in your life, you just sound like a big liar. Oh, this is a quote from a friend of mine, Carrie Miller. A junior engineer is just a senior engineer who hasn't broken production yet. But there's so much value in talking about your mistakes for so many reasons. It normalizes other people making mistakes and admitting and talking about them too. This is particularly important for folks that are more senior because naturally junior devs are more afraid to like come out and admit about the mistakes they've made. And I think it's really common for them to feel like senior folks like never make mistakes ever, which obviously isn't true. So I think it's really important for them to see like more senior engineers like making mistakes, admitting to it, and like talking about it really openly. It makes you a good teammate to talk about your mistakes. It means that you're taking responsibility for when you've messed up on something. It's not falling on the rest of your team. If you're honest about what's going on, your team then can like band together and resolve these mistakes faster. That's what happened at GitLab. And this sounds a little counterintuitive, but it inspires confidence in your work to talk about your mistakes because it shows that you know when you're wrong and that you can admit it, which are good qualities to have. I will note that this all kind of assumes that you're in a reasonably healthy workplace. If you're in like a totally unhealthy workplace, then there can be like consequences to admitting about mistakes you've made. That's a bad culture to have because it's just gonna like force everyone to have like really unhealthy communication. But I kind of wanted to say that because like it can be a real factor for some people. Another thing I remember speculating about at the time with GitLab was like what was going to happen to them as a whole company. They were pretty new still in 2017, and I mean this kind of outage and data loss is like rough in general, but like they host people's repos, so it was really rough. I honestly thought that this incident was going to kind of just completely kill GitLab as a company, and they were going to like not exist anymore, and I was bummed about that because like I used GitLab and I liked it. But they put out this postmortem afterwards. That I was so impressed with. I think it's one of the best examples I've ever seen of like a public postmortem. As you can see, maybe it's kind of small, but it's a 21-minute read on Medium, so like an extensive postmortem. They also talked pretty openly about it in like interviews and stuff. I'm not gonna read this whole quote, but it's basically talking about the fact that like all of GitLab's customers are also developers since they host code. And developers, it kind of gets at a couple of really interesting factors. One, that developers tend to be more sympathetic to like other sites having incidents because we've all been there and we know that those people are like not having a good day. But I also think that's kind of cool because in turn, I think it can maybe make us a little bit more sympathetic to ourselves when we're dealing with incidents because we know that like other people have also been there. We're all kind of on the same boat. But the other thing about it, this quote, and about the postmortem in general, is that like being honest and open about incidents creates a lot of trust. And I think that that trust is kind of what saved GitLab. This postmortem they put out proved that like, A, they took the problem seriously. B, they were being honest about it. They were being honest about like kind of where they said that they were, which means that in the future, maybe you can trust what they say about what's going on. And they were taking real steps to ensure that it didn't happen again. So I think it's a great example of just like how to handle this kind of thing. And the team member one thing I just like so much that they were like not throwing this person under the bus. So I know I just talked about why the word shame is kind of troublesome, and now I'm like immediately going to talk about a wall of shame, but just hear me out for a second. So before I was in tech, I worked in television production. And I was a manager for a while at a local public access station, and I was in charge of like all of our on-air personalities. And we had this wall of shame on the wall, and whenever something major went wrong on the station, which was often like on-air personalities saying something like wrong or silly while we were live, it would go on the wall of shame. But even though it used this word shame that I'm not too fond of, the culture around the wall of shame that we had was like not about punishing people, it was about humor. Like people liked to read the wall of shame because it had funny stuff on it, and if you like had time in between stuff, you would just go and like read it. And it always said stuff like, you know, January 15th, the teleprompter was not updated to reflect changes to the order of anchors today. And Jamie reads on live TV, and now back to you, Jamie. And so everyone felt really positively about the wall of shame, and it became kind of like a rite of passage to get put on the wall of shame. And so then when someone said something wrong on TV, instead of getting like embarrassed and flustered in that moment, it was like, well, this is going on the wall of shame, I guess. I'm not necessarily suggesting a wall of shame specifically. I can see a lot of ways that that could go wrong if you're not all on the same page about it like we were. But I think the underlying message I'm trying to get at here is like creating a culture where making mistakes is just something that everybody does, and it's something that we can all laugh about together. That like removes a lot of the stigma that causes people to have a lot of feelings about it and like not want to talk about it. It's something I try to bring to my own life too, because I feel like if I can make jokes about my own mistakes, then it makes me feel differently about them in my brain. And like I was saying earlier, I think it's very important for senior folks in particular to be very transparent, but that still can be really legitimately hard, especially if you still suffer from imposter syndrome, even when you're a senior engineer, which is super common, especially for underrepresented folks in the industry. So for me, making it into a joke is like a way to make myself feel more safe about sharing this information that might otherwise make me feel very vulnerable. That said, I do think there's something worth saying about self-deprecation. Like too much self-deprecation, even as humor, can be like harmful to the psyche. And so I try not to make jokes about myself that are too mean. It's not about being mean to myself. It's just about normalizing this act of talking about it. So if you read these jokes, I'm not going to read them out loud because it's a tech talk and not like stand-up comedy. But you can see that these are all pretty good-natured and not too mean about my own work, which is pretty important. So while we could do a really good talk about how to foster that kind of culture, ultimately that's not something that people can always do on like the individual level. And this talk is more about fostering like individual kindness towards yourself. And so that's why I want to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. Disclaimer, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I don't have any specific background in this, but I've been using cognitive behavior therapy myself for my own anxiety for a really long time, and I find it really helpful. And so that's kind of what I want to share about it. This is just a basic overview, but I want to talk about a few aspects of CBT that I find particularly relevant in terms of like imposter syndrome and like work-specific anxiety. So the aspects I'm going to talk about are automatic thoughts, feedback loops, cognitive distortions, and cognitive reframing. So the idea of automatic thoughts is like very central to the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy. Most of the thoughts that we have just kind of happen to us without really thinking too hard about them. It's because our brains are just so practiced at interpreting the world around us that they have this ability to form really complex thoughts without us doing much work into that. Sometimes this is great and it's really efficient. Like, if you see that there's a car coming in the road, you don't have to have a whole internal dialogue about, like, what we're going to do about the car. You can just move out of the way. Your brain can, like, interpret that right on its own. But other times, it's really unhelpful to have a bunch of thoughts in your head that kind of just popped in there without, like, reflection or reasoning. You hear people talk about intrusive thoughts a lot, often in the context of, like, violent thoughts, which, like, is a thing, but intrusive thoughts, like, encompasses a lot more than that. There's a lot of different types of intrusive thoughts that I'm going to talk about in a few slides, and that's, like, the concept of cognitive distortions. But, like, think about it like this. Like, have you ever met someone and, like, made an assumption about them without really thinking about it, and then later that assumption wasn't true, and you felt, like, really bad? Like, why did I think that about this person? We can't really help having a lot of those types of automatic thoughts. They don't necessarily reflect how we actually feel about things. It's just kind of how our brains are wired to bring thoughts to us. And I think it's really important to realize how many of the thoughts we have every day are happening this way. Because it's interesting once you start thinking about, like, how many of your thoughts you put there on purpose and how many are just there by accident. And it kind of leads into this concept of feedback loops. There's a model in CBT called the ABC model of emotions, which means that there's an activating situation which triggers a belief or a thought, and that then leads to a consequence or a feeling. And the idea there is that the activating situation doesn't inherently carry any emotional weight. Like, if you're stuck in traffic in the morning and then you're feeling anxious and you're like, oh, I'm going to be late to work and then I'm going to get in trouble, and you have all of these, like, automatic thoughts and they lead you to these feelings, but, like, being stuck in traffic itself doesn't inherently carry any emotional weight. But it leads you to have these emotions, and then thinking about your emotions leads you to have more emotions. So when you're feeling negative already, it, like, inherently points you towards feeling more negative. I get this really dumb thing called secondary anxiety, where, like, I know that I'm an anxious person, and I get panic attacks, and I'll be like, oh, I'm starting to feel anxious. Oh, I hope I don't have a panic attack. Oh, I'm going to have a panic attack. It's going to be awful. And then, like, it causes it to happen. Causes panic attacks. And also, bad feelings, like, are very physical. They're not just emotions. Like, these are just some examples for me with my anxiety and panic specifically, but there's, like, so many physical ways that it can manifest. Like, my heart will race, I have trouble breathing, I'm very tense and achy, I get really bad stomach aches. If I'm, like, really anxious, I'll, like, throw up sometimes. It's awful. Get, like, very hot, over-flushed. And when you're having a lot of bad feelings in your body, then it reinforces these negative feedback loops, because, like, it feels bad in your body to feel bad, and then you have these negative emotions. The theory of cognitive distortions, which is, like, what we're going to talk about for almost the whole rest of the talk, was proposed by a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck in the 60s and 70s, and then his student, David Burns, popularized a bunch of the common names for the different distortions in the 80s. This is a quote from the student. I suspect you'll find a great many of your negative feelings are actually based on such thinking errors as these cognitive distortions we'll talk about. And the more you practice these thought patterns, and you're practicing them, by the way, every time you allow yourself to have them without attempting to correct it, then the more entrenched they're becoming in the way you think. Your brain kind of remembers the shape of the thought patterns it often has. So if you're having a lot of negative thoughts all the time, then you're naturally going to try to have more negative thoughts. But if you're spending more time practicing having positive thought patterns, then it'll come more naturally to you in the future to have those positive thoughts. The technique for stopping cognitive distortions is called cognitive reframing, where reframing just kind of means looking at a situation differently, like stopping, thinking about it, and looking at it differently. And that, too, will become automatic over time as you practice it. Okay, I've used the word practice like a whole bunch of times. And so you might be thinking, all right, you've convinced me on this idea, but how do I actually practice any of this? The first step is to notice when you're doing cognitive distortions and like negative feedback loops. If you can't tell when it's happening, then it's impossible to stop it. So this step is really important, and actually it also requires a lot of practice. But the good news is that once you're aware of some of the types of different cognitive distortions, which we're about to talk about, it can help you recognize when they're happening, because you can be, oh yeah, I heard about that. It's still really hard though. Once you realize that this is what's happening, you have to evaluate the evidence. You could try, one thing I've tried before is like writing down a column of evidence that like proves or suggests that this negative thought you're having is like correct, and then like another column of evidence that proves or suggests that it's not, and it's in your mind. I find that actually physically writing it down, for me at least, is a really helpful step, because like when your brain is telling you something negative, like it can be really loud. You could have like really loud negative thoughts in your head, and I like to be able to like pick up this physical piece of paper where I wrote something down and be like, no, this is still here, like this is still true. And the other thing you have to practice is compassion towards yourself. This is kind of like that theory that if you fake smiling enough, the act of smiling will like eventually positively influence you anyway. Speaking kindly to yourself is kind of the same. Even if you don't believe the kind things that you're saying to yourself when you start, saying them over and over like will eventually positively influence the way you think about it. I try to think about treating myself as kindly as I would treat my friends. I often think, if someone was treating one of my friends the way I'm treating myself right now, would I be happy about that? And the answer is often no. Another thing that's really important when you're thinking about your thoughts and feelings is being able to name those feelings. The feelings wheel, I'm sure this is way too small for you to actually read, but you've probably seen it before, and you can use it to kind of figure out what name you want to give to the feeling. I find it's really helpful in like figuring out that specific name, which isn't always as easy as it seems. I have a limited amount of time, so I can't do a whole talk about feelings, but I do recommend the best talk I've ever seen about feelings, Hacking Your Emotional API by John Sowers. Also, I will make these slides available online afterwards. So. All right, so this is not an exhaustive list of all of the kind of named cognitive distortion patterns. But I've chosen a few that I want to talk about that I think have particular relevance towards like work anxiety and imposter syndrome. So this is the list of ones I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about each of these individually. Okay. All or nothing thinking. This is like when you assume there's only two possibilities. It can only be this way or that way. It removes any kind of potential gray area or middle ground. So what might that sound like if I was having like an all or nothing thought at work? I made a mistake today at work, and my performance review is coming up next week. Now there's no way I'm going to get a good review. Okay, well, let's take that thought and try and reframe it. What might that look like? Making a mistake is really frustrating. You'll notice in a lot of these, I try to name the feeling that I'm having, because like I'm going to get a bad review now isn't a feeling. I'm frustrated about it is a feeling. Making a mistake is really frustrating. This one was particularly frustrating because of the timing, but I'm just going to do my best. I don't think that a single mistake will ruin my whole performance review. I've done a lot of other good things too. Ooh, catastrophizing. I love this one. No, I don't love it, but I do it a lot. This is like the worst case scenario. The small thing happens and you're immediately thinking about like the worst possible outcome that could happen. Oh, I caused an incident today and I just know I'm going to get fired and then I'm never going to be able to find another job and I'm never going to work in this industry again. Okay, let's reframe that. Actually, I don't think I would expect to get fired over a single incident. But even if I did, I found this job and I'm sure that I could find another opportunity. Fortune telling. This is when you're making dramatic predictions about what's going to happen, especially if they're like not based in evidence in any meaningful way. Oh, the last time I did a deploy, it brought the entire site down. I have to do another deploy today. I'm sure it's going to happen again. Let's reframe that. I did mess up last time, but I learned a lot from my mistake when I did that. Now I'm better prepared not to mess up again when I do it this time. I'll just take it one step at a time. Labeling is creating overgeneralizations that have like a negative judgment about a whole person. Actually, it doesn't have to be a person. It could be anything. But I'm talking about like a person because I think in the context of imposter syndrome, I'm kind of assuming that you'll be labeling negative things about yourself. So you could like make a negative judgment about your whole self based on just like a small amount of evidence. I overlooked a really obvious bug in my code today. I'm so bad at this. I'm a terrible programmer. Okay, let's reframe that. I made a mistake today. I missed a bug that felt really obvious. I'm feeling embarrassed about it. Naming the feeling, embarrassed. But now I will know to look out for stuff like that next time. I'm learning from it. Magnifying the negative. This is when you're kind of focused solely on just the negative aspects of a situation. Focusing on them that much lets them become exaggerated and feel like bigger than they are. Jess found 2 typos in my code when she reviewed it today. It must seem like I wasn't even paying attention to my work at all. Okay, well, let's reframe that. The rest of my code was good. Typos really aren't that serious of a mistake. This is what code review is for. Jess caught them. It didn't end up being a big deal. The counterpart here is minimizing the positive. And these two really go together because when you're very focused on what went wrong, it's super easy to forget about the parts that went right. And then you're like ignoring the value of all of the like positive things that you did in a situation. My manager complimented me today on fixing that bug, but like it was really easy. Anyone could have done it. She was probably just trying to be nice. Just trying to be nice is like a phrase that's one of the banes of my existence because I'm always like, oh, my friends don't really like me and they're probably just trying to be nice. Like, even though the reason that you'd want to be nice to someone is like you like them. Let's reframe this thought from my manager specifically. You know, I did really good today. My contributions are valuable to the team. That's why my manager told me that, because she wants me to know. Magnifying the negative and minimizing the positive are 2 sides of the same coin, and it's the coin that causes people to do this, which I think is very relatable. It's how I feel all the time. Mind reading is kind of an interesting one because like trying to figure out what the person you're talking to is thinking is like a really natural part of communicating with other people. But when you read too far into what someone else might be thinking, and particularly like when you assume that you're like definitely right about what they're thinking, it can become a problem pretty quickly. Oh my gosh, David left so many comments on my latest PR. He must think I'm really stupid. Okay, well, let's reframe that. I feel self-conscious, naming the feeling, self-conscious. I feel self-conscious about the fact that David had so many suggestions, but I know that he only wants me to improve. He's complimented my work before. I'm sure that he doesn't think I'm stupid. This one's a true story, and my coworker David, the first time he saw this talk, like came to me afterwards like, I don't think you're stupid, just so you know. I was like, I know, that's why it's in the slide. Overgeneralizations. This is when you're drawing broad conclusions based on just a little evidence. You're assuming that all of your experiences are going to be the same because you had a bad experience once. When you hear words like always or never, you're probably thinking of in overgeneralizations. oh no, I got asked to give a demo tomorrow. It never goes well. I always mess it up. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you go into a situation already having negative feelings about it, then it's much more likely to go bad because you're kind of setting yourself up for that. That's why it's particularly important to try and reframe these kinds of thoughts to be more positive before you walk into a situation, because then you're manifesting better outcomes. I do get nervous doing demos. I know that I have struggled with them in the past. But this time I have a chance to make sure I'm really prepared. It's going to go great. And then it's more likely to go great. So I think self-blaming is a particularly big one, in my opinion. That's actually kind of why I did the whole case study about team member 1. Self-blaming is when you believe that it's all your fault. You're solely responsible for a negative situation that happened, even when there are factors outside your control, which there almost always are. And it's very rare in tech for any one person to be solely responsible for any situation. A bug I introduced caused our whole app to crash. It is all my fault. I wrote that code. Well, how could we reframe that? It's true, I'm the one that wrote the code that introduced this bug. But my coworkers tested it too, and they approved my PR, and they didn't catch it either. It's not all on me. We're succeeding or failing as a whole team. I think if everyone internalized this idea of succeeding or failing as a whole team, that we'd be a lot kinder to each other in general, and perhaps kinder to ourselves too. I know I just said a bunch of things that probably sounded pretty simple, but actually, this stuff is really hard. It's hard to even make the decision to examine your thoughts in the way that we just spent, a half an hour doing. And all of you made that decision by choosing to come to this talk, so that's the first thing. The thing I like about cognitive behavioral therapy is that a lot of tenets of it are pretty simple to understand, at least. And once you understand them, then you can start putting them into practice. But changing the way you think, those shapes of your thought patterns in your brain, is hard work, and it doesn't happen immediately. You'll mess it up lots of times. I still mess it up all the time. Not all the time, but I still mess it up a lot of the time. But it's additive. The more you practice at it, the better you'll get over time. The more times you do a good job, it doesn't take away from the times where you still struggle with it. And remember, I'm proud of you and of all of your mistakes. Everything that you've accomplished, all of the mistakes you've made, and everything that you've learned from them are all part of the you that you are right now. And I think that's pretty great. Thank you for listening. I hope that even one of you found this helpful. It's been helpful for me. That's why I like to talk about it. I'm really grateful that Refactor invited me to talk about it. You can find me online. You can find me at the conference. I'll put the slides up. And we have time, so I can do some questions right now, too. Ooh, questions. Okay, I saw you first. Yes. No, I cannot be your therapist. Although I think therapy is so great and important, and I love when people, whenever someone starts talking about, oh, well, my therapist said, it's my ears, perk up. I'm ooh, free therapy. Tell me what your therapist said. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's totally fair. I have pretty severe anxiety. It's why I like to talk about mental health stuff at conferences. And I do this worst case scenario game in my head, and a lot of my friends are like, why are you this isn't helping you. I'm like, no, it is though, because I like playing the worst case scenario game when I'm very anxious, because I'm I will pick out the worst possible thing that happened and then go well, that's not that bad. That probably won't happen, but if it did, it would be okay. Yes.
some of the reframing has made it easier to try new things?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that like having a lot of interests I find it really valuable because like I don't have to pin all of my like self-worth on like if I'm good at one thing, if I'm good at writing code. Like I think I'm pretty good at it, but like that's not the only thing I do and it's not the only thing that's like valuable about me. And I think like trying new things and starting new things, there's a quote, one of my favorite quotes ever is from Adventure Time, and Jake the dog says, "Dude, sucking at something is like the first step towards being sort of good at something." And I like that so much because A, it's true, and I like that at the end of it, you're still only even sort of good at it. And I think that like going through that process of learning something and sucking at it and being sort of good at it and then maybe being like even better at it later is like humbling, and it makes you better at other stuff, and it makes you better at like communicating with people that are learning stuff too.
I find myself like softening like the language I use to deliver feedback. Sometimes like, oh, this sounds one little tiny thing on this PR. No big deal. You can totally still merge it. And then like I'm like, is that me making space? Is that making it easier for that other person, or is that just my own anxiety of them thinking that I'm a big meanie for finding something in their code? So like I'm thinking about like the flip side of like.
That's a good question. I think it probably depends a lot on the person, so it's hard to answer. Like, I think that just, like, communication, I need a lot of reassurance that I'm doing a good job at work, and because of my anxiety, like, it will expire. So, like, if you say, oh, you're doing a really good job, and then you don't say anything, I think a lot of people would be like, well, they said I was doing a good job, and that's the last thing I heard, so I guess I'm doing good. But I'm like, nobody's told me I was doing a good job in like a whole week. I must be awful at it now. But like because I know that about myself, I can tell my manager, like, you know, I kind of just need to be told if I'm doing a good job, just like once a week or so, just like drop that one in there. And so like talking to people directly about like, you know, what works for you, like how do you feel about this, I think can be really helpful. Yes. Thank you. Oh, that's so nice.